Identifying with characters is a fascinating subject, and it's come up in a couple of different topics and games and situations recently. So I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about it. Now, according to some studies, apparently, as I keep hearing from Sargon and a few others, um, but computer game players don't tend to identify with their characters. What's going on rather is that they are identifying as themselves, using the character to overcome challenges and so on, and to represent their skill in the game. So story-wise, they might empathise with the character, they might sympathise with the character, they might put themselves into the character situation, but that's different to identifying with the character, and it's an important distinction to make, I think. So people apparently don't identify with the characters that they're playing, and that makes sense to me. Rarely do I identify with a character in any form of fiction, whether it be a film or a TV show or a computer game or book or anything. I don't identify with the characters. I sympathise, I empathise, I put myself in their position, but at no point do I necessarily identify with them. There's a few exceptions, but that's beside the point here, really. Now, where this has been particularly interesting recently has been in regard to the game Rust, which recently changed things so that when you log into the game you get a face and features and everything depending on your product key rather than your choices. So you don't choose the race and appearance of your character, you're stuck with whatever genetic hand you're dealt. And quite a lot of people were upset by this because in those kind of games I think you get part of your buy-in by the character customization. I know it annoyed me in Destiny when I couldn't give my character a beard, because often in those kind of games I like to make an avatar that looks at least vaguely like some idealised version of me. It just helps if you're teaming up with your friends. It sometimes, not in Destiny because your head's covered, but in other games sometimes it helps you work out who you're playing with a bit better if they bear some kind of resemblance to the person they are in real life. And despite years of effort, there's very little role playing that goes on in MMOs. So that kind of fell by the wayside in exchange for team play. So, but that was interesting because there were people talking who wanted to play as different races, but they've been denied the opportunity by this data version of genes that they've been given that made them look differently. So that took them out of the game even more than usual. So that's an interesting reaction to contrast that with the sense that people don't identify with these characters. I think when you're creating a character, you get more buy-in, not necessarily in terms of identity, but in terms of control, and this is my representation. There's more of a link when you get to choose your character's characteristics and so on. The other interesting thing that happened fairly recently was the change in GTA 5, which took it from a third-person point of view to a first-person point of view. And the shift that created in people's relationship to the game and the violence the characters were doing, and the driving and everything else, because it brought it into a very different perspective. Now GTA 5 was, despite people's criticisms, a very narrative-heavy game, and it really played off three different archetypes of maleness, which is why I think the criticisms of it for not incorporating women were a bit invalid. Got the guy trying to do the right thing, you got the young kid trying to make his name, and you got the crazy guy who just rejects society. And at least for me, that made the game a hell of a lot better and more interesting as a story. But yeah, it was definitely at a remove, because you're watching the characters do things, and you're following their story. You're just taking control for the action part. You're not making any choices on any particular other level other than the order in which you proceed through the story. So the shift to first person and the reaction that people had to that was interesting. I still don't think it's identification, but it brought them closer to the action and placed them directly in the seat rather than watching someone else do it. So it took them from that more passive narrative view of this is a story that I'm watching unfold into feeling more that they were doing the actions themselves. And it didn't necessarily have the same remove that other first person games have. You know, this is your mission, do this. I think the free roaming aspect gives people more agency and choice as well, which draws you closer. Now, comparing all these things to tabletop has been particularly interesting, because if you go back to really old school tabletop, what you would do is you would roll your dice and you would take whatever the result was on the stats, and then you'd make your character up to fit in. So your dice rolls, your genetic lottery, if you will, would limit your options. Like if you roll high strength, then it probably makes sense to play a fighter. If you roll high intelligence and wisdom, then you should probably play a wizard or a cleric, and play to your strengths. Sometimes it was fun to play against those strengths, play an incompetent wizard or something, and sometimes you would roll really badly and just have to try and survive with what you had. And to a lot of old school players, I think that sense of risk and lesser buy-in at the start of play, but more as you go along, I think that's fueled a lot of the old school renaissance, that sensation. Whereas more modern games, even D&D, you know, you've got other options for rolling, where you can build your characters with points, and some you've got merits and flaws. So you're constructing a persona, and you've got a lot more buy-in right from the get-go. And games these days also tend to de-emphasize character death in favor of narrative and story, which increases buy-in, I think. And again, you're creating this persona because, you know, not to identify with it, but to represent the kind of stories that you want your character to get involved in. So, you know, if you roll up a roguish, swashbuckling ladies' man thief, you're not just creating your character, you're also telegraphing what kind of stories you want to play in, and the kind of things that you would enjoy in the game, and the kind of things you enjoy in stories. So again, it's not necessarily identification, because you are not your character, but it's empathy and sympathy, and also saying what you want. So that's interesting as well. So where is all this going to go? I don't know, really. I think what's limiting buy-in in computer games, and what still makes tabletop a superior emotional and narrative experience, is the freedom. In a tabletop game you can do whatever you want. Even in free roaming open world games like GTA, you can't do whatever you want. You know, you can't pick up a stone off the ground and beat someone to death with it. You can't write your name in chalk on the sidewalk. You know, you can't go up to a random man or woman on the street and try and convince them to come to bed with you. You can only go to the strip club or whatever. Your options are always going to be limited by the software, in a way that the imagination and our ability to talk and converse with each other isn't limited in the same way. And that's still what makes tabletop games superior to me. This is particularly obvious when it comes to in-character moral choices in games. In computer games, some games have tried to bring this in, but it's generally limited to a binary choice. You have a good choice and an evil choice, and that's it. So it's either, would you like to rescue this busload of nuns, or would you like to burn this sack of kittens? And there's no subtlety to it, and it's hard to model. It's hard to model subtlety and personality, and to give you true agency over the actions of your character in these games. Whereas in tabletop you can do that. If you've got a good games master, they will listen and they will incorporate everything that you do, and there will be consequences. So I think that's limiting true buy-in. I still don't think we're going to have identification with characters in the way that people think we're having identification with characters or identification with the situation. I think it's still limited to empathy and sympathy and interest in the story and wanting to succeed and overcome the challenges. And I think that's where it's going to stay, even in tabletop for the most part. Very rarely you will have instances where you truly identify, and those will be good moments. In tabletop, what we strive for is not identification, but rather what we're looking for is what we call immersion, in that you get lost in the story, lost in the moment, you take on the character, you're not identifying as them, but you are becoming them in that scene. So when everything's in sync, when the descriptions are working, when you can picture what's going on in your head, when you know how your character would act and feel rather than yourself, that to me is immersion, and that's what we're going for. And that might be a better thing for computer games to aim for as well. But what do I know? I've only been doing this 15 years. Alright, take care. Peace out.